9 times out of 10, the first thing they'd be like, oh, you must make really good tips. And I always thought that was the weirdest thing to say. The belief is behind that statement is, wow, you must get extra money that you like haven't earned or don't deserve, or that's kind of a bonus. It would literally be like me if someone was like, oh, I'm a corporate lawyer, me saying, wow, you must get a nice paycheck at the end of the week. Like it's not a normal response. And I would say, yeah, that's how I get paid.
Hey everyone, and welcome to our January video essay here at TFD. And we wanted to start the year by exploring a phenomenon that has increasingly been on everyone's mind.
If I have to go up to order, I'm not tipping.
0%.
Zero. At this point, I work there.
The constant bombardment of requests has led many Americans to experience tip fatigue, which can lead to actually reduced gratuities.
Do servers ever get tired of complaining about the tips that they get? You know you're not entitled to any of the tips. Like
buying a water, self-checkout. Who is this even going to?
No, literally, just pay people a living wage and leave us alone already.
Now, we are going to explore a lot today. We're going to talk about the tipping wars, the business models that rely on tipping, the very questionable labor laws that allowed us to even get to this place, and what might be coming next, at least in terms of legislation. But we also want to explore tipping more generally as not just its own problem, but kind of a micro example of a macro dynamic that happens in a lot of American economics, which is to say a level of hyper-individualism and burden on the consumer rather than the business owner that nobody ever asked for. Now, I am someone who used to be a tipped worker. I used to work in restaurants, and notably I used to work in coffee shops. And at the time when I was a barista, tipping at a coffee shop was just a lot less common. I usually worked at smaller coffee shops where the hourly wage was generally better than something you could get at like fast food or a fast casual place. And we would still get tips on top of it, but tipping with credit card wasn't really normalized. So we would just basically have a tip jar out, and whatever was in there at the end of the day, we would pool amongst the shift workers. It was always kind of looked at as a supplemental thing, and I remember that a really good day would be a day that I took home something like $40 or $50 in tips. But a coffee shop is an interesting example because it has become one of the places now where tipping is just totally integrated into the process in a way it didn't used to be, especially at a lot of these smaller establishments. You might have seen this happening a lot.
I'm gonna say next. Would I like to leave a tip?
Where the screen is just going to ask you a few questions while the person grabs your food or prepares something or essentially just stands there. This really didn't exist when I was working these jobs, but now they are everywhere, and not just in coffee shops. In fact, if you frequently purchase food or beverages outside the home or use convenience apps, like we talked about in our convenience culture video essay, or just generally engage with any kind of service these days, you have probably noticed an explosion in the expectation of tips. And areas that used to not adhere to the standard tipping protocol, for example, things like picking up takeout or buying prepackaged foods, have now become often not just tip jobs, but jobs that are prompting you, the consumer, with the standard sit-down restaurant percentages of 15 to 25%. Quote, and more types of employees are now asking for tips than in prior years, according to Cornell University professor Michael Lin, who studies consumer behavior. Tips were traditionally given to workers who earned the so-called tipped minimum wage, federally set at $2.13 an hour, and thus rely on tips to earn the balance of their income. Most commonly, these tipped workers are waitstaff at restaurants and bartenders. Tipping has been spreading to occupations that earn the regular minimum wage or above, such as baristas and drivers, Lin noted. That raises the question of whether consumers should feel obligated to add a tip of 20% or more to their check when a digital kiosk is swiveled around for payment, a tricky issue when inflation-weary patrons may not feel like adding a tip for being handed a cup of coffee, yet may feel shamed to deny a tip request in public. Reasons why we have come to this place of, as we'll get into, tipflation. But one of the biggest, both in terms of the percentages that are being prompted and the pool of jobs which are now expected to include tips, is the pandemic. And there are good reasons for this. For example, many of the traditional tipped workers, like servers, were not able to work their usual jobs, and many of those same workers were still on the tipped minimum wage. In general, service jobs were considered essential and putting themselves at an unusually high level of risk to provide consumers with both essentials and sweet little treats. Many service-based jobs saw an extreme decline in customers, meaning that the ones who did show up had an outsized responsibility to make up for the customers who couldn't come. But many of the tipping trends that originated or expanded during the pandemic have continued long after most of the other customer behavior has returned to normal. And this phenomenon has led to a consumer backlash, a dynamic so widespread that it has its own name: tip fatigue. From the same article, Tips at full-service restaurants jumped 25.3% in the third quarter of 2022, while gratuities at counter-service restaurants rose 16.7% compared to the same time in 2021, according to Square, one of the biggest companies operating digital payment methods.
To hear a first-person account of the reality of living off of tips, we spoke with Jake Cornell, a comedian and longtime former bartender.
I am a comedian in New York City, but I was in the restaurant industry for a very long time. The restaurant industry is how I supported myself for the better part of a decade. And before that, I worked at an ice cream shop. But I started bartending when I was 19. And I bartended through all of from sophomore year of college all the way until I was able to go full time with comedy in 2021. In terms of how things have been since the pandemic, obviously I haven't been full time since for like 3 years of it. It's been 3 years since I was full time, but we're really doing it at all. I think that the pandemic certainly to some extent fostered a certain higher regard for restaurant workers and it being a profession and it being valued. I think that was the thing I experienced a lot before the pandemic, was that restaurant work was really looked down upon. And I think culturally it still is in a lot of ways, and in some circles it still really is. But I think it was much more unanimously looked down on and treated like an inferior industry and an inferior profession before the pandemic. I think the pandemic really showed people how much they cared about going out and being able to go out and being able to go out in a way that was really enjoyable. Literally, restaurant workers were considered essential workers. Like we were sent back to work before everyone else. So I think it did create a certain level of respect. And I think that has transitioned over to tipping. I think that now what is happening that is getting tricky is I think it's still inherently a broken system. And also I'm seeing now so much more of like, there being a tipping screen at Dunkin' Donuts, and there being a tipping, like the number, and that I think that is creating a level of tipping fatigue where I think we're about to see a backswing where people are just like, I can't tip on everything and I can't tip this much on everything. And so I don't know that, like, even if things are good right now, I don't know how sustainable that is. And I think there is also an element of, some people are tipping really well, but I also think we have a younger population who was not trained socially in restaurants because of the pandemic, who are about to start going out a lot more.
So we've reached a place where more and more of these workers are relying on these tips for their income, yet more and more consumers are reaching their limits about how much they can or will tip out. So what do? Well, to start, we go back to Chapter 1, the history and dynamics of tipping. The inherent tension of tipping lies in that it leaves people's livelihoods up to the kindness or lack thereof of strangers rather than their employer or the state. The problem with this kind of dynamic is that it doesn't really matter how good of a job the service worker does. If the tipper's having a bad day or doesn't believe in tipping or doesn't have the extra money or withholds tips based on whatever reason they feel, the service worker, and we'll dive more into the repercussions of those choices later, is the one that suffers. And like so many other social customs that we have accepted as normal in the US, this power dynamic has deep and dark roots. From a 2018 Time magazine article, quote, wealthy Americans in the 1850s and 1860s discovered the tradition, which had originated in medieval times as a master-serf custom, wherein a servant would receive extra money for having performed superbly well on vacations in Europe. Wanting to seem aristocratic, these individuals began tipping in the US upon their return. And interestingly, at the time, there was pushback to tipping in America. It was actually seen as classist, which is a sentiment that eventually did make its way back to Europe, a continent where tipping is much less pervasive than in the US, generally speaking. But even with its initial unpopularity, tipping culture actually gained a massive foothold in America. In part thanks to how we had not culturally or societally moved on from slavery. Quote, after the Constitution was amended in the wake of the Civil War, slavery was ended as an institution, but those who were freed from bondage were still limited in their choices. Many who did not end up sharecropping worked in menial positions, such as servants, waiters, barbers, and railroad porters. These were pretty much the only occupations available to them. For restaurant workers and railroad porters, there was a catch. Many employers would not actually pay these workers under the condition that guests would offer a small tip instead. These industries demanded the right to basically continue slavery with a $0 wage and tip, according to Saru Jayaraman, co-founder and president of Restaurant Opportunities Centers United. Also, I highly recommend you read that article in its entirety. It is extremely fascinating.
To get some expert insight into the history of the tipping economy, we spoke with Georgia K. White, a labor historian and PhD candidate at Brown.
Tipping culture largely comes from Europe, the European aristocracy. When it comes to customs, you would have, people, they would go to like a certain house and they would tip the servants in order to get better service, or they would tip them for discretion. So it really was like a customary thing. It wasn't anything that was ever expected. And what you find is that at the turn of the 20th century, after the Civil War, you have tipping becoming more of a prevalent part of American culture because you have an increase in, wealthy businessmen who are investing in railroads or investing in the infrastructure of America, and they're becoming this new class of elites, and they're really trying to replicate European culture. They're trying to be tastemakers and, influence each other to kind of like come up with their own sort of customs. And the customs that kind of stick is tipping, because tipping is incredibly profitable for their bottom line. So I think modern day tipping really influences class divides because it creates this sort of dynamic where the worker is incredibly dependent on the consumer, and consumers have the upper hand. They're essentially the managers of the people that they're interacting with. And what you have is that instead of like regulating the type of what you will be paid for your labor for a certain time that you see in other industries, with tipping, you are literally at the cyclical whim of seasons. You're at the whim of, the type of clientele that you get at any given moment. And so for people who are working tipped jobs, it's incredibly important that they're performing a lot of emotional labor for the consumers that they interact with. And what you see is that oftentimes the people who are tipped workers are women and marginalized groups, including people of color, migrants. And this is not by accident, it's by design, because a lot of these jobs are intended to be sort of like intermediary work where the rhetoric is that you will continue into like more salaried position, but that's not often what happens. Is that a lot of people end up sticking long term with tipped work because of barriers to entry when it comes to moving to salaried positions or having higher education that would give them more career flexibility. And so for a lot of people who end up in service work are doing tipped work, they find that they are sort of like stuck in this perpetual cycle of, one, you can't make enough because you're at this like cyclical whim of who's coming in, what season is it, where do you live? But also you are more than likely part of a marginalized group that's already kind of hard to get out of those positions. And so it's just like a lot of compounding factors, I should say.
But similar to our prison labor system, which essentially provides an exception to things like minimum wage laws and other labor rights under the framework that certain people just don't need to be paid a living wage, it's really no wonder that tipping has become such a uniquely American phenomenon. In the US, tipping has ultimately become expected in many circumstances, from restaurant servers to Instacart delivery to taxi or Uber drivers to movers, whereas in a lot of other countries, it's either not at all expected, minimally expected, or seen as a gesture of gratitude. Anecdotally speaking, we've also started to see how increased American tourism to foreign locations has influenced tipping expectations elsewhere. And if you're wondering, yes, people not in America are getting more than a little frustrated on the American tipping culture making its way overseas.
When I bartended in England, it was before I had ever bartended in America. So it wasn't like I was coming from being a tipped employee to not being a tipped employee. I was being paid an hourly wage, which was the same as when I'd been, an ice cream scooper in high school. And so the differences didn't really jump out to me until I moved back to America and started working in American bars. But I think looking back, I think tipping does at some point create a notion of power over the person. You work for me because at the end of this interaction, I'm paying you, and I think that can create a degradation in respect. I think that like at a pub, at the pubs I worked at, we had a lot of training about giving good service, and it was like there was an idea of customer service, but it also was not, there isn't a threat looming over view of, oh, I'm not getting paid today if I get these people mad. And there's much more of a stern culture when I worked in the pubs of like, hey, if you do this, we'll kick you out and there's no problem, you know what I mean? And then I started working in fancy restaurants in New York, and it felt like you could do almost anything and we would barely reprimand you because we were so afraid of. And that was from management down. We were so afraid of losing business. We were so afraid of losing the tip, so it was like, it created a much more toxic dynamic, I think, but I think it also I think it has more negative than positive in that regard. I think the people who are going to connect to their bartender, connect to their servers and have like become regulars in that way, that happened in England the same way it happens in America, regardless of that financial exchange of like the tipping well. So I do think I think it does just create a little bit of a different dynamic in terms of like respect a little bit.
And this isn't hard to understand in America. For example, in a country where we have at any given time like millions of GoFundMes happening to replace what should be readily available medical care, it's not surprising that we've embraced a system where we have to rely on the kindness of strangers in the absence of policy that ensures a fair wage for all workers. And in some ways, it's almost the ultimate expression of American individualism. If you're a tipped worker, then getting a great wage is just a result of how well you work. Of course, we know in practice that this isn't true, but we're still able to convince ourselves that tipping is just a reflection of how well a job is done.
Tipping has become the norm largely because of consumer culture. In the US, you see that there is more of a mass dining culture than you see in other countries. And along with that mass dining culture is this incentive to have as low cost as possible for the businesses to attract customers. And so you find that if you have like, say, a tipped minimum wage of like $2.30, you can have that. You can have lower prices on your menus, which will attract customers. You don't have to include, the full cost that people would see and kind of like deter them from interacting with, mass dining if it's not something that's in their budget. And so specifically tipped work, and we see this a lot in the restaurant industry, hospitality industries, there is just a greater incentive for the business side to continue to hire tipped work, to lobby for workers to continue to be tipped at this, standard wage where they can like have profits and still attract customers. But also from the other end, the consumer, there isn't a lot of push for workers, at least not on a mass scale, because a lot of people enjoy sort of like the overall culture, American culture of having access to incredibly cheap on a more global scale access to that type of like environment of you get served, you go to somewhere, you sit down, where in a lot of countries that's just more of a treat as opposed to like an everyday sort of part of like the cultural fabric of like a middle class aspirational lifestyle. And so I think two things would need to happen for this tipping culture to kind of really be overhauled and to make a lot more progress for the workers themselves is that there would need to be more restraint on the consumer side where people would think more critically about why is it that you can have, like a meal at a restaurant like several times a week for like a certain price that would not really be fairly compensating your server. But also the business incentive, like why do businesses continue to have the power to pay their workers in this way? And so overall, I just think the largest like culprit is the consumer culture in the US, and that in other countries, when you look at countries in Europe specifically, you have more union protections, you have more calls for ethical practices when it comes to things like that. And so you have less of people are less attuned to like this insane sort of like constant need to be entertained and served in that way.
And it's also worth noting that tipping, unlike many other things, is not a very partisan issue. Tips were part of both candidates' platforms, mostly led by Trump, and there's even a no taxes on tips bill that would greatly impact service workers. Quote, one tax embraced by both of the major candidates for president in 2024, first proposed by President Trump, is exempting tips from federal taxes. The idea has picked up steam with Republicans in the House and Senate, some congressional Democrats, and labor union leaders. Under current law, tips are still taxed as regular income. And while this is at least some recognition that the current tipping model is unsustainable for workers, what it decidedly doesn't do is enforce the rule that everyone must be paid a living wage so that tips are really that, a gratuity on top of the actual wage the person is being paid. In which case it would be much more appropriate and accurate to make it simply based on quality of service as opposed to a scenario where the person serving you literally does not make enough money to live if everyone isn't tipping a certain amount, and it's not really a tip, it's just their wage. But on that note, let's go to Chapter 2, the tipped minimum wage, a little loophole of theft. So we all know, or at least I hope we all know, how bleak the current state of the minimum wage is in America overall. And for the record, it has been for decades throughout many presidencies from both major parties. Currently, it's holding strong at $7.25 an hour for over 15 years now, despite the fact that it would be about $26 an hour if it had kept up with inflation. But the tipped minimum wage is somehow even worse, the rationale being that tipped workers will have the difference in their paychecks made up by tips. Quote, under federal law, employers can pay workers as little as $2.13 per hour, much less than the minimum wage, if the tips they receive bring them up to a baseline salary. This applies primarily to restaurant workers, although other employees who receive more than $30 a month in tips may qualify. And while some states have made strides to increase their own tipped minimum wages or even outright abandon separate wage standards for tip workers, a very low tipped minimum wage is still standard in many states. Quote, for instance, in Delaware, Nebraska, and Rhode Island, the regular state minimum wage is scheduled to reach $15 per hour in the coming years, yet the tipped minimum wage in each of these states remains less than $4 per hour. And for context, this tipped minimum wage functions by allowing employers to claim what is called tip credits. Quote, tip credits allow an employer to credit a portion of an employee's tips toward the employer's obligation to pay minimum wage. Tip credits are not deducted from employees' pay. Instead, if permitted to take a tip credit, employers may claim a certain amount of gratuities the employer receives against their minimum wage requirement. Basically, this means that an employer of tipped workers in a state with a $2.13 tip minimum wage and a $7.25 standard minimum wage can claim tip credits of $5.12 an hour, as long as enough tips were earned to cover that amount, the equivalent of $204 a week that they would not have to pay their employees. So why does this matter if tipped employees can still earn at least minimum wage after accounting for tips? Well, it matters because it could mean the difference between a bare bones paycheck and a livable paycheck. Our tipping culture is deeply ingrained in this point, so it likely wouldn't make a difference to customers to know how much an employee is being paid hourly. And if the employer in this scenario was paying the federal minimum wage outright and the employees were paid out the same amount in tips, that's over $200 a week of additional income without any difference in hours or workload. But more importantly, how is this not wage theft, both from the actual employees, but also the customers who are now entirely responsible for subsidizing this employee?
When I first started working in American bars, I worked at places where you walked with your cash tips. So you would claim when you clocked out, you would enter into the computer how much you had made in cash, but so that it could be like documented for taxes or whatever, but you walked with the cash in hand, right? And so all of your FICA, whatever, like that was all taken out of your hourly wage, factored in with whatever you had reported. But what that meant was that we kind of all knew that your hourly paycheck, like you would work a 30-hour week, your hourly paycheck was truly sometimes like 5 cents or $0 or like $10. So it was like we would joke like there were employees that wouldn't pick them up for months and then like stack them all up and then go to the bank, and the cumulative deposit of like 3 months of paychecks would be like $50. You know what I mean? Like that's what it was. When I moved to New York, and everything, we didn't walk with anything. Everything went into management, and then we were given like a full paycheck of everything we earned that week. I remember seeing, the amount of it. You learned pretty quickly your hourly wage. And also back then, the hourly wage was much lower. Like I'm talking, this is like 10, 12, 13 years ago. The hourly wage was completely subsumed by your taxes and then some, like it was. You were not only not making the hourly wage, you were making less than what you had accumulated in tips, because the taxes were higher than what the hourly wage would total. So that made it really hard on days when you knew you were not, like tips were not well, or if you got stiffed on a big table or if someone really screwed you over. It was like, wow, I'm really working for free now. Like at this point, I'm truly I'm working to pay taxes and not walk with cash, or not get paid anything else, Those days were really hard. I know that the hourly wage is higher now, which is good, objectively very, very good. But I think still, people, if you work at a place where like the hourly wage is the bare minimum of what the government requires, especially with like inflation and what it's been in the past few years, like the tips are so necessary to make that a livable or comfortable wage, like so beyond necessary.
The tipped minimum wage is really the idea behind it, right? Is that you would have this like minimum wage that's below federal minimum wage, but that the workers would meet that standard by tips. So they would get tips that would bring them up to that threshold. But oftentimes what you see is that there isn't like a lot of oversight when it comes to like individual like restaurants and their practices and how they implement that. And so even though you're supposed to on paper, like, oh, like actually technically you're not just making that wage, you're making that in tips. And a lot of times the argument is that you make more per hour if you make tips because you have like the generosity of the customers. But the issue with that is that it's one, as I said earlier, is that it's incredibly hard to like oversee on an individual basis. But two, that is not always the case. It's not always the case that workers will meet that threshold. And oftentimes there's a seasonal nature to a lot of the hospitality industry. So you might make a ton one month and then next month not be able to pay your bills at all. And so there is that like level of precarity for the worker where there isn't like a standardized, like, this is how much I'm going to make and this is how much I know at the minimum that I'll be able to cover my living expenses. And so you just have like this really sticky situation for the laborer where, one, there's less, because of the dependence on tips to kind of like meet that gap, you are less inclined to sort of like ask for better protections or to set boundaries with your consumer base because they're literally your, you know, bread and butter. They're the ones who are going to be filling that wage gap for you. But on the flip side too, the employer is sort of like kind of like hands off, where it's like, okay, well, this is the nature of tipped work is that you kind of like work to incentivize to make more money. And so there's like less of a responsibility on the employer side to their employees, which creates this like rift, right? Because it's like if you're working for someone, there should be more a responsibility to them, like reciprocal responsibility, where they're responsible to make sure that you are not only protected, but also meeting your bare minimum wages that you should be making.
Essentially, we've created a system where in certain sectors of the economy, it is literally customers who have to make payroll and not the business owner. And for the record, the way the system is set up means that employees still get screwed even if business owners opt out of the tipping system, especially in fine dining, where higher bills often translate to much higher tips and therefore much higher wages for employees. We saw this happen when popular NYC restaurateur Danny Meyer made headlines for switching to a no-tip model for many of his group's restaurants. Now, this move was not a net negative, as it arguably provided a more equitable payment landscape for all workers in the restaurants. Back-of-house employees saw their wages increase, for instance, but many front-of-house staff claimed that they saw their overall pay go down drastically, even when they were told it wouldn't be the case. They ultimately ended up bleeding his restaurants of 30 to 40% of their legacy staff, and his restaurants eventually reversed this decision.
I help out occasionally at a restaurant that my friends work at that includes service charges. So, and they're all paid like a very solid wage, like they make good money there. And when they present the check at the end, they explain that to the customer. They say, you know, here's this service charge. It's split among the staff of the restaurant, front and back of house, so we all make like a good wage. There is an option to tip additional, but that is on top of the fact that we make a good wage. So that is completely optional, like no pressure. It's just something the system offers. And it's also a lower amount. It's not 20%. I think it's like 3, 5, or 7%. I think that's kind of the perfect version of it, you know? Because I think I think that culturally tipping is not going to go away. That's always been a thing. So and some people want to, generally out of kindness, be like, oh no, I want to show my gratitude financially to this experience. You know, you see it a lot of the times, like people who go to like countries that don't tip, you know, and culturally it's like, oh, don't tip here. And it's like, some people are like, it's really important to me to show my gratitude in this way. So I think we should keep those channels open, but people need to be making a living wage regardless.
Now, this is not to say that no tipping models can't be equitable, but they only work if they actually follow through on what they promise, which is better wages and quality of life for workers, not padding the pockets of those at the top. Because the real question in places like fine dining, where huge margins are being made by the restaurant on every bill when it comes to food and especially alcohol, is if the tip model goes away, where are the rest of those profits going? Spoiler alert, I think you already know where they're going. But part of what makes this entire tipping culture so frustrating, especially as it pertains to the people at the top actually running these businesses, is how much they have separated themselves from this new burden being placed on customers at basically every turn. Which brings us to Chapter 3, The Screen is Just Gonna Ask You a Few Questions culture. As we discussed in the intro, many of our current tipping norms, and certainly the scale and breadth at which we are seeing tipping, has its roots in the pandemic, and again, for some good reasons at the time. But another factor in the recent ubiquity of tip prompts is the integrated and, in many cases, automated kiosk or tablet culture. Business owners aren't stupid, and they know the social dynamics of tipping when the person who is theoretically receiving the tip is literally staring at you, and our own psychology around pricing and negotiation, mean that if they ask you for more, you will pay more. Quote, at the same time, restaurants and coffee shops are relying on point-of-sale kiosks and portable credit card readers that can be programmed with preset tip amounts. And merchants are setting the baseline tip at 18% or even higher because it generates more revenue. Research shows that the more you ask for, the more you're going to get. Those options that start at 18% generate more revenue.
What's always been tricky about the tipping conversation in restaurants, and especially in like small business restaurants, which a lot of New York restaurants are, a lot of restaurants across America are, is I think sometimes the critique is often, well, like you should be paid higher wages. And the problem is that money doesn't exist a lot of the time. It's not like the restaurant owner is pocketing this enormous it's not like Amazon where like the owner of the restaurant is pocketing this enormous profit and like withholding it from the workers. The margins of restaurants is paper thin because the business model was designed on tipping because that's how the industry has worked for 100 years. So the solution is not that simple. It's not like the owners make less. And I'm not defending owners, but I'm saying that's for the vast majority of restaurants, that is not what's happening. You know what I mean? Some owners are making less than their floor managers, you know? That's like the reality of some of these restaurants. So in those situations, it's like, okay, we have to look at how this system can be changed in terms of probably pricing if we're going to, you know, eliminate tipping or whatever. But I think in those situations, I always tip. I tip very well because, you know, I know that I'm making kind of a social contract when I go into small business restaurants like that I am there for that experience. And part of that is tipping the servers and paying them for what they're doing. And I factor into my budget for it tipping well because one, I think it's an investment in me going back there. Like selfishly, it's an investment in me going back there and having a rapport with these people. But also I just think it's the more ethical thing to do. With something like Dunkin' Donuts, we do know that there's people at the top making, you know, 9-figure salary, like something like absurd amounts of money. It is frustrating to me the notion that I am supposed to tip on top of that business model they've been thriving. Dunkin' Donuts has not like downsized in the 32 years I've been alive. So there's not really an argument of suddenly, oh, we need to start tipping these employees. You've been able to pay them. You've grown exponentially. You should be paying them more. So that is frustrating to me. Where I get kind of mixed up about it is I don't work at Dunkin' Donuts, so I don't know. Is there some sort of new law and now the Dunkin' Donuts corporate has the ability to pay their employees less because they've made them tipped employees. And so if I don't tip, is this person no longer making sustainable income? And this is where tipping gets really frustrating and really hard to talk about and hard to sort of contend with is what tipping has always done, in my experience, is it puts the customer-facing workers as the first line of defense against everyone else in the company. Because, you know, if something goes wrong, you know, if something's made wrong, if there's an error, there is a notion of like your first act of recourse is, well, now I don't have to tip. That's my reward for that's my apology for this thing going wrong. And that punishes the person who should be punished the least. You know what I mean? You shouldn't be docked your wages for that. And so similarly, if Dunkin' Donuts is doing this, and you know, it's all of them, it's Dunkin' Donuts, it's Starbucks, it's, you know, whatever. If these companies are doing that, do I punish the workers for that? Or do I tip them appropriately and then, you know, send an email to my congressperson or try to like, you know, sign a petition or do work at the top so we can make that should be eliminated? Because I don't think that people who work at a corporate company that's valued at however many millions of dollars, I don't think their employees should be tipped. I don't think you know what I mean? Or at least I think they should be paid like a very substantial wage so that they don't need to be tipped.
And it's also worth noting that there are many non-mathematical or technological factors that impact how much we are likely to tip someone. In the case of food service, things like a server smiling more or using your name or even bafflingly physical contact, which I don't understand why that would make someone want to tip more, but apparently it's effective. Also, fun fact that wearing clothing or accessories that stands out more is actually also demonstrated to help improve tips, which I guess means that Office Space was right and that pieces of flair actually do have an impact. But as we talked about in our convenience culture, many of our current apps and tools are designed to make spending money as seamless and fluid as possible. Or in this case, tipping on top of money we've already spent. Often, we don't even need to write our own tip anymore. Even many servers who come to your table will bring you the actual credit card reading device, which just prompts you with automatic tip percentages. You don't even have to do math. We only have to press buttons which are increasingly aligned with an inflated expectation of normal. And again, we usually have to do it under the watchful eye of the person who is theoretically receiving the tip. But it is worth noting that in many cases, the workers themselves don't even receive the tips, or at least not all of them. Quote, according to the Center for Urban Economic Development's National Employment Law Project, 12% of employees surveyed reported that their employers had stolen tips from them.
Wage theft is absolutely an issue when it comes to tipping culture because of what I mentioned previously, which is that there is very little oversight on an individual basis. And so you do see complaints come about in the restaurant industry, particularly where you're supposed to meet that gap. You're supposed to make sure that the worker is being paid. There's like a tip credit where it's like, okay, if you're not making this much, the employer has to fill that. And so oftentimes that's the biggest case that you'll see is that employees are just simply not making what they should be making based on standardized forms of minimum wage, whether that be state, federal minimum wage.
Speaking personally, as someone who worked several tip jobs, I can tell you that at least one scenario in all of them had some form of tip skimming. And I think if you were to ask people who work in these industries, it's more the norm than the exception. But still, even if the worker is seeing all of the money, all of these advances in tipping technology and the increasing expectation per tip is clearly designed to create a new social norm, one where the consumer is more responsible for the employee's livelihood, both in overall percentage and the amount of workers we're talking about. And make no mistake that this is not about the worker, it's about offsetting the need of the employer to pay a fairer wage, and in many cases, augmenting the actual revenue in the case of tips being skimmed or held outright. These frequent prompts are now just one of many tools to change our social expectations, and the more integrated a tip is for basically every service, the more social pressure there is to conform to what the new expectation is. This can also be seen in the creep of percentages as part of a tip. Many industry sources will now say that 20% is the minimum at sit-down restaurants, often erring toward 25 to 30% depending on the service, a number that's increased sharply during the pandemic. It's worth noting, though, that this is how actual diners break down on the subject. Quote, the Pew survey found that 57% of American diners tip 15% or less for a sit-down meal, which includes 2% who say they wouldn't leave any tip, and only about 22% of people said they wouldn't leave a tip of 20% or more. But you only need to search for content about these subjects on social media to see that the overwhelming view of people who rely on these tips is that tipping at least 20% should be the minimum for an increasing number of services. And again, I want everyone to lower their weapons in the tipping war, because although often that anger can be directed at the customers, it's more the fact that this system is faulty and was never really meant to work in the first place. Because again, as we recall from our earlier chapters, it was a vestige of a time when the people relying on these tips weren't even expected to be paid at all. But it is understandable that the people who rely on these tips would be demanding about them when we think about Chapter 4, what it's actually like to live on tips. So there can sometimes be a perception of tipped workers that they go home every night with a fistful of cash, or are just generally doing better than non-tipped workers because of their variable ability to earn more, which is theoretically under their control. But the reality is actually quite different. Quote, over a third of tipped workers living in New York City are near or below poverty, compared to 20% of non-tipped workers eligible for the full minimum wage. The typical tipped worker living in New York City had median earnings of $22,000 annually in 2017, about half of what non-tipped workers earn, $42,000. Nearly 1 out of every 5 tipped workers living in New York City use SNAP or food stamp benefits, compared to 15% of non-tipped employees, and 28% of tipped workers received Medicaid, in contrast to 18% of non-tipped workers. And this disparity is not limited to big cities with huge wealth disparities like NYC. Quote, across the US, poverty rates for tipped workers are 2.3 times as high as poverty rates for non-tipped workers, 11.3 versus 4.9%. And according to a 2021 analysis of poverty rates across states with different tipped minimum wages, states that pay the lowest tipped minimum wage allowed by law, $2.13 an hour, have the highest poverty rates amongst all workers, but especially amongst tip workers. And there are definitely jobs that heavily rely on tips where you can earn a great living. I personally know multiple people who can and do make 6 figures a year working in the restaurant industry in particular here in New York City. But these situations are largely the exception. First of all, it's in one of the most expensive and touristed cities in the world, let alone in America. But this is also often people who are working at higher end places where the bills of which we are taking a percentage are much higher on average. And it's also important to remember that even in situations where these workers are taking home higher tips, they're not seeing the benefit that many other full-time jobs have. For example, there are often little to no benefits like sick leave, PTO, mat leave, retirement, etc. They're extremely physically demanding and even sometimes dangerous. There's little predictability on your schedule. You're often working later odd hours.
Yeah, working for tips does put some workers at a disadvantage in their job. One of the biggest things that we tend to see is like higher rates of sexual assault for especially like women who work in service industry, and that's an unfortunate side effect. There's just a lot of power on the consumer side, and even just this idea of the customer is always right. I think we're slowly moving away from that. But there's still a large ethos of people who just feel like you have to sort of like service the customer to any end because you are dependent on them to pay your wage. And so you see sexual assault as one of the sort of hazards of the tipping industry because there's just that sort of like imbalance of power, but you also have just general like workplace hazards when it comes to you're not having like a ton of like workplace benefits. You have a lot of people who are, especially you have people with disabilities, different sort of like personal factors that go into how they are able to sort of like maneuver that sort of workspace. And by the customer having that much power, it does sort of like create a dynamic where people might not be making enough to even like cover their bills. They might not be making enough to cover their health expenses. A large part of it does come down to the simple finances of it, where it's like, okay, if you are not, the exceptional employee who's gonna rake in all the tips, be on your feet all day, not have any health related issues where you can't go in for your shift so you can't make enough money. That's really the only way that you can really make it work sustainably. And oftentimes that's just not the case for most people. They can't make that work long term.
I think in general, something that I found very frustrating the entire time. I think the general population's notion about tips is that it is more often than not people making more money than you would expect for what they're doing. I always talk about this when for the entire decade I worked in was a bartender. Whenever I said to anyone, I'm at a party, I'm at a dinner, I'm anywhere, and I meet someone and like, oh, what are you doing? I say, I'm a bartender. 9 times out of 10, the first thing they'd be like, oh, you must make really good tips. And I always thought that was the weirdest thing to say because I don't think they realize that what the belief is behind that statement is, wow, you must get extra money that you like haven't earned or don't deserve, or that's kind of a bonus on top of whatever money I'm making. It would literally be like me if someone was like, oh, I'm a corporate lawyer, me saying, wow, you must get a nice paycheck at the end of the week. Like it's not a normal response. And I would say, yeah, that's how I get paid. That's the money. And I think it really highlighted this thing that I think people think that like, you hear these fantastical stories about the people who worked in the bars in New York and were making, $1,500 a night in cash at like the hottest cocktail bar. And that happens, but that's the one, you know what I mean? That's like referring to the success of like Nicole Kidman and saying that's all actors in America. It's like most, you know what I mean? It's like, it's not, that's such an outlier of what is happening to most people. And most people, I would say, are making a lot less money you'd think. And also, you don't really understand it's hard to understand what it's like to have a job where nothing is promised to you. There's no guarantee, hey, if you make less than this, we'll make it up. You know what I mean? It's like I worked at restaurants where if it rained all week, you might make $700 less than what you normally made. You know what I mean? If you were normally making $1,000 a week and then it rained all week, your paycheck's $300, and that's no one's problem but your own. And there's no way to predict that. If the health department if the health department inspects the restaurant one night, the restaurant has to close that night, and then you're out, you know, $100 to $400 depending on where you work for that night. And again, that's no one's problem but your own. There's no one to be like, oh, sorry, that happened. Here's that money back. And so you have to live a life where you really have nothing guaranteed the next week in terms of what's coming in financially. And that is hard. And you learn over time how to like build a situation that's like more stable than that. But like when I was young, it's really hard. And I think people generally think more often than not that it's people making a lot of money on easy work. And that's just not the case.
But even with all of that in mind, the reality is that a majority of tipped workers don't make enough through tips to compensate for the severely depressed wages.
Tipping culture does perpetuate cycles of poverty because we see that in the data when it comes to especially states that have like the bare minimum tipped minimum wage, that there are increased levels of poverty for those workers. And so it's obviously very case dependent because you have places where there's more of like booming industries where you have more people who work in like, upscale dining where you might make a little bit more. It's so context dependent. But in general, the issue with tipped work is that there's a lack of equity because you will have, a business that will be very financially lucrative for the workers. And that might be, a very stable position, but you don't have that everywhere. You don't have that even on a like worker to worker basis, because you do see sometimes that there is a level of, whether that be prejudice or discrimination with the way that people tip. So you have people who tip more for, workers based on things like attractiveness, race, like nationality. And it's kind of like the dirty side of tipping that people don't like to think about. But because there is no standardized, you have to tip this much. Like the whole concept of the tip is that you get to decide what you're going to tip. And so when you have workers who are of like, multiple demographic backgrounds, there are disparities there. You find that people who, are not like, especially for women, there's like a level of, you have to, there's that additional level of gender stereotypes of like how you kind of like are perceived by your customer base. And so there's a lot of really unsavory parts of tipping culture from the consumer side when people decide how much to tip and why they want to tip, because it's completely in their control. And that's the issue. Like the consumer should not have that much control over the person who is like employed at a particular institution.
Working with variable income also impacts our ability to budget, fundamentally changing our perception of money and making it harder to long-term plan, both because you're not as able to accurately make projections about your earnings, but also because you can easily convince yourself that a few good nights can make up for any number of financial mistakes. For the record, when I was at my most chaotic and indebted financially, it was when I was working a lot of these tip jobs or odd jobs because I was always convincing myself that I could justify bad choices because I could always just take a few extra shifts and make a ton of money the next week. Spoiler alert, that didn't work out. And it's also worth noting that tipped workers tend to be younger on average, which may contribute to their fluctuating financial situations. Quote, the median non-tipped worker in 2023 was 41 years old. The typical tipped worker, in contrast, was a full 10 years younger, 31 years old. A third of tipped workers are below 25, with 13% being teenagers. And there is a perception that tips translate to easy money, and while this is definitely not true for the reasons we discussed, it's also a very dangerous pattern for your mind to get into when it comes to financial planning or budgeting. For the record, you can go on basically any social media platform and see people who work in various gratuity-based industries doing things like money spreads, and often in ways that are pretty indistinguishable from people doing the same thing for illegal work.
$1,507 as a bartender this week. Not bad, not bad.
$663 here in cash, and then I have checks as well.
Friday $150, Saturday $200, Sunday $3.
I've got a good wad of cash, so I'm really excited to count it with you guys.
So we have 20, 40, 60, 80, 100.
But even when the money is good for these workers, it's important to remind ourselves that it's still extremely unpredictable, in part because even if all else is equal, the money they take home at the end of the day is still extremely dependent on the whims of a few customers. Which brings us to our final chapter, the entitlement of withholding tips. So you might be asking yourself, if this extremely flawed system is responsible for tipping culture in the first place, then why am I the customer having to pay for it? And I don't think that enjoying a meal out at a restaurant should be a privilege that necessitates the ability to pay for gratuity up to a certain amount, but the reality is that in our current situation, it does. I think the phrase, if you can't afford to tip, you can't afford to eat out, is harsh, but in a lot of circumstances, I can't claim it's not true. Because whether we like it or not, when we participate in existing systems, we have to understand our roles in the power dynamics at play. As the customer of a tipped worker, how you handle your gratuity directly affects their ability to pay for rent and groceries. And unless a restaurant explicitly discloses that a living wage and benefits for all workers are included in the cost of their pricing, you can assume that this is not the case. And as we mentioned earlier, tipped workers are in fact more likely to live below the poverty line, which is especially true in states with low minimum wages. And I do want to clarify that, at least ethically, there is a difference between workers who are receiving the tipped minimum wage for whom their entire livelihood is dependent on these tips, or workers who are being paid a normal or even higher than average wage for that industry and are still expecting the same level of tipping. One is more technically akin to an extra discretionary gratuity for above and beyond service, while the other is just literally how they get paid. And in my opinion, not tipping, especially a worker who relies on it, is not an effective way to take a stand against this unfair system, even if you dislike the culture of tipping, because don't we all? Because you're not sticking it to anyone in that scenario except the individual service workers who may not be able to pay their bills because of your exertion of free will. Whether or not you tip makes no difference to their employer, the one who's actually perpetuating this system.
I don't think I went a week in the 10 years that I worked without getting stiffed at least once. The people who like make a stink about it and like performatively declare like I refuse to tip or like I'm not tipping you, I guess a little less, much less common because people are generally conflict averse and like it's much easier to just write a 0 on the check, or because it's also the other thing is like you think of the people who, refuse to tip or like are mad, like because they're like against the system and think it's wrong. And so therefore they're punishing you for that. That's one. There's the people who are mad at you because their pasta took too long or whatever the reason is, that's another reason. There's also the person who got drunk and forgot to sign the check. And I'm not allowed to say, well, they probably would have tipped 20%. So we'll just add 20% on. You're not allowed to do that. There's also the people that sign the check and then accidentally put both copies in their wallet. And now there's no check for you to close out. That's another tip you don't get. There's also the person who did the math wrong. And instead of tipping 20%, you saw them write 20%, but then the total they wrote at the bottom is 5% because they're bad at math or they were drunk. You know what I mean? So you add that up and there's a lot of lost income, an enormous amount of lost income to some cruelty, some carelessness, and some error, and and sometimes a check gets thrown away. There's all these systems, and that's no one's fault except maybe the servers, but even still, like it sucks. So there's a lot of things that happen that result in a lot of lost income.
And the idea that you as a customer have the power to decide who is and isn't deserving of tips puts you in the position of the employer, essentially deciding whether an employee has earned their commission. Because let's be clear, there are plenty of people in every industry, especially white-collar ones, who do basically nothing at their job and yet still get paid at the end of the day. And a lot of people will be like, well, what if I get bad service? So my personal rule for restaurants with tipped minimum wage workers is if I get bad service, I will still tip them the normal amount, but if it's really egregiously bad service, I will say something because maybe they should not work there anymore or have a discussion with their employer or something, but they should still eat. Like they should still be able to afford groceries because they technically did do their job. Because in those situations, I don't actually perceive the tip as being reflective of service. I see it as reflective of like a server coming to my table and giving me food. And for the record, that's only happened like one time and it was truly egregiously bad service. I won't even get into what actually happened, but trust that I did call them back later and had a conversation. But either way, I'm still not gonna like sit there and be like, oh, well, I didn't like you, so I guess you're not going to make rent this month. And the contention over tipping culture is most often viewed from the perspective of the customer and not the worker. Several years ago, there was a big discourse in the personal finance community about tipping after an article was published detailing on how dropping to 18% tips from 20% could save you about $400 a year based on the average American restaurant spending. And the framing is only about how much an individual could save, not the potential collective consequences faced by tip workers if all of their customers started doing this. Let's say someone was earning $500 on tips every week or $26,500 a year, being tipped out an average of 20% on $130,000 worth of restaurant tabs. If that average tip from all customers dropped to 18%, that means they would earn just $23,400 on tips per year, over $3,000 less than before, just to save individual customers a few $100s a year. And yes, the problem is systemic and not individual, but I would argue that participation in these systems makes us all complicit in them. So the real question becomes, what do we do?
I am hopeful that tipping culture will change for the better. I think as a labor historian, oftentimes what you see is that there's a lot of push and pull. Like when you think about even the Great Depression, that was a time where you see a lot of labor laws come into effect when you have standard work hours, you have the minimum wage and things like that. But those were hard fought battles and they took several decades of people pushing. You have strikes, you have workers really calling for those things. And so I think sometimes it can feel a little bit discouraging when you're seeing people who are really organizing for better workplace protections, better workplace, pay, and it's not happening. But I am hopeful that it will happen because we see that it happens. But oftentimes it's like the formula has to be right. It has to be, you know, a moment where there is some sort of leverage there for, you know, especially on a policy level for things to change. But also it comes down to like consumers and individuals really taking like some sort of like insight into themselves to say like, how am I contributing to this? Because as much as we don't want to put it on individuals, because it's not just an individual problem, it's definitely like a systemic problem. But as individuals, we do have a little bit of power. We have a little bit of power to think about how we're interacting with these systems and how we're interrogating these systems. And really, especially when we're thinking about the demographic makeup of women and marginalized groups who heavily make up the service sector, is really taking into account what does it mean when our most vulnerable people in this country are working in a position where they are at the whim of not their employer who's supposed to be responsible for them, but at the whim of sort of like the markets and at the whim of how people feel like paying them at any given moment. And so I think that what would need to happen is, one, there needs to be more of a consumer push, but two, there also needs to be like continued advocacy on a policy level. And I think when all of those factors come together, there will eventually be some sort of overhaul or change in the way that we see tipped work in the US.
Now, obviously, people in general are not happy about the role that tipping has started to take in so many different areas of our lives. And many people find it truly financially unsustainable. Like, I also personally agree with the idea that if I am going to, let's say, a fast casual place where I'm being handed a prepackaged item, or go to like a coffee station to serve myself and I'm still being prompted to leave a 20% tip to someone who's already receiving a full wage, I don't really think that that is on par, ethically or otherwise, with someone who's receiving $2 an hour and also performing a service. But this constantly expanding definition of who should be tipped and how much starts to beg the question of, then, should everyone just be tipping everyone all the time? And why do we not just build these tip expectations into higher prices and call it a day? Because at least then it would be somewhat predictable. And the refrain of, if you can't afford to tip, you can't afford to do X, works in some scenarios, but at this scale clearly results in a situation where basically no one but wealthy Americans can afford to do a huge number of things. And as we saw during the pandemic, customers disappearing en masse is not a sustainable solution for these jobs. But also the current setup, even in the best case scenario, barely works for tipped workers, leaving them in a cycle of precarity at best and poverty at worst, totally dependent on the whims or schedules of their customers.
I think capitalism is such a huge part of this conversation, and it cannot be understated that a lot of what I feel like needs to shift from just like, you know, as a person who's like deeply steeped in like the literature of like labor history, is a more conscious understanding of the underlying motivations in a capitalist society, which is to do things as cheaply as possible for maximized profit. And so I think as long as that continues to be sort of like the motivating factor and people don't interrogate or push back against that, then we'll continue to see like new iterations of exploitative labor practices. Because at the end of the day, if the argument against tipped work is that, oh gosh, it's going to make, you know, it's a little bit harder for the businesses to make like an astronomical profit. Obviously, we want profitable businesses, especially when it comes to like small businesses, but we also want workers who are living a bare minimum standard of living where they can afford to have access to healthcare, afford to have access to the things that they need to survive. And I think oftentimes those things are pitted against each other because it's always like, well, how cheaply can we do this thing? And I don't think that that is a fair comparison at all.
We talked earlier about the proposed legislation to exempt tips from federal taxes and mentioned that it is bipartisan. And although it's always heartening in this day and age to see basically anything be bipartisan, I actually think this is a solution moving in the wrong direction, in the sense that it just makes people even more reliant on tips and encourages employers and their workers to more and more orient their pay scales toward tipping. In my opinion, we should be moving to a model much closer to the European one, where there are very few tips, and in the scenarios where they do exist, they are a true gratuity that is not expected because the workers are already receiving a living wage. Like in France, for example, you might leave a few euros on the table, even up to, 10, 20 euros if it's a really exceptional meal or a really high bill. But in general, it is not expected to be paying the wages of the workers, and those workers also have labor protections like other jobs do. They get vacations and time off. They have healthcare. They're not relying on their tables to be providing 100% of their livelihood. And yes, French waiters are assholes, but I prefer that because I don't need a person to be my butler. I just need them to bring the food to my table. This is a side note, but there's such a culture in America of refilling water glasses like every 30 seconds. And I really like that in Europe and other cultures, they just put some water on your table and you're a grown up. You get to decide when you need to refill your water glasses. Like, I don't need you working like this. Just bring me my food, it's all good. And ultimately, the problem does not lie with the consumer, but rather the employer. We need to be demanding a move away from tipping culture altogether and an end to the tipped minimum wage and a prioritization of businesses who pursue better models for their workers, not just their owners. We can also, as consumers, inform ourselves on the tipped minimum wage and understand where our gratuity is not really optional, but the foundational part of a worker's wages versus a purely additional service fee that can be considered much more discretionary.
Like, if you're asking, like, it was being a bartender and being a server and working in restaurants harder than being a full-time comedian in the day-to-day, absolutely. You know what I mean? In the larger terms of like planning my career out now and figuring out, you know, the next project or whatever, like that, there are harder aspects there, I guess. But like, I'm my own boss now. I build my own schedule. I don't have to, you know, I know how to set my systems up, my systems up for success so that I can do what I need to do. And that's not the case in restaurants. You know, restaurant work is so much harder than most jobs. You know, it's so much work. And the added thing of a lot of the times it's being looked at as like unskilled labor, like deeply unskilled labor. And you're seeing, you know, you're utilizing your decades worth of experience and still being pushed to the breaking point because these jobs are so hard. And then people kind of still think, you know, oh, what are you trying to do when you don't do this? And plenty of people are like career servers and bartenders, like for good reason. So yeah, it's a very hard job. I haven't worked as hard at anything as I have in restaurants.
Overall, though, we need to be putting down our swords and stop fighting with each other when the clear enemy is the business owners and legislation who are creating and reinforcing and profiting off of this system. Even that annoying little tablet prompt, like, yes, it's a part of the problem, but it's not the real enemy. Because the question is not if you can't afford a 30% tip, why are you at a restaurant? It's if you can't afford to pay a living wage, why are you opening one? But as always, guys, that's just one queen's take, and I will see you back here next month for our brand new video essay. Bye, guys.